Hi, I'm Lujayn. I'm a writer who works a lot with poetry and creative nonfiction. I'm based in Wurundjeri country and I am originally Palestinian Lebanese.
Hi, I'm John. I am a writer and audio producer, and I live and work on Wurundjeri country as well. Hi, Lujayn. It's really nice to be talking to you.
Yeah, it's weird to do it digitally. I feel like I'm still, after a year and a half, not used to digital communications, but we'll get there.
We'll get there. um, I suppose, I don't know, I think I'm just going to jump right into, I'm going to jump off that because something I really love about your piece for this issue of GDS, sorry, this issue of Going Down Swinging, I should say the full name. Your piece, Watching People, Hearing People Breathe, which is a very beautiful, I'm not gonna embarrass you or myself by trying to sum it up, but it's a beautiful threaded, poetic, actually I said I wasn't gonna do that. So I just want to talk to you first up about embodiment, because I think it's a really corporeal piece of writing. So I would love to hear you speak a little bit about how that factors.
Mhm. I noticed my writing undergo, I mean, not just in this essay, but this is one example of it. My writing underwent a pretty drastic shift during lockdown where there was a lot of overt positioning of the body that started happening. Um, and originally it was something where I was positioning or situating myself in a piece pretty explicitly. And then it turned into second person commands to the reader. Um, and so it started off with a different piece that I'm working on, which then became a manuscript. And then it snowballed into everything that I ended up writing had that kind of telling the reader what to do with their body and me um, being hyper conscious of mine. And I think a lot of that just came from being in lockdown and being kind of aware of the confines of my body and feeling like almost as though it was pulsating in the space that I was taking up um, because I was in such a stagnant kind of the four walls were so stagnant, but I was moving in and out of it. Um, so a very abstract way for me to talk about embodiment, but that's the context to it, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I guess to bring it back to something really sort of basic, that kind of that call to the reader and that immediate implicating them in relation to you, um, it feels to me like a kind of attempt to reach through the prophylaxis of screens and distance and, um, you know, as you say, kind of becoming more aware of yourself in space and the sort of containment of it. Prophylaxis is kind of a theme here, especially if we talk about the kind of augmented reality aspect. Would you like to talk a little bit about how that kind of, whether I'm off the mark or whether that has...
I'm going to embarrass myself. Could you define that for me?
Sure. I mean, you know, a prophylactic being a kind of a barrier. The condom wrapper is kind of prevalent in imagery in the work. Candy wrappers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. There definitely was this kind of sectioning off, and I think it was twofold. The first one being um, it was representative of this distance of myself and the outside world in a social sense, but then also this hyperfixation on cleanliness and needing that barrier as well. Um, so there's the condom wrapper, there's sweets in their little plastic, there's the banana and duct tape at Art Basel, and like how the duct tape was um, sectioning off the art from the audience in like this protective manner. Um, and yeah, again, that it also, all three of those images that I just mentioned are also overtly and maybe more implicitly um, sexual. And I feel like kind of having this image of a banana and like a lolly that you suck on, and needing to section it off was also, I think, a nod to that barrier of physical intimacy that we are still kind of enduring right now and started last year.
Yeah, and in writing about this, you know, what did it help you think through, or was it an expression of and there's this kind of really beautiful, vital need for like muckiness and dirtiness, and I love that that's so tangible in this piece. But yeah, I guess did this sort of help you unpack any of that?
There were multiple threads going through my head at the time, at the time of writing this piece, and I had all these different intentions that I was trying to piece together in one essay. So to put it, I think, to like list it, it was physical intimacy and sex. It was cleanliness and muckiness and dirtiness. It was queer embodiment. And it was this like social distance and social segregation. And these things were all quite big things that I had to reconcile. And then through that, I kind of started thinking a lot about the AIDS pandemic, and how that encapsulated a lot of what I'm thinking right now. And then comparing that to COVID-19 just kind of, again, melded everything quite beautifully, in a way that felt metaphorical, and I couldn't ignore that. So the yuckiness and the suck and like all the sucking, and that's this kind of subtle, maybe not so subtle, nod to homoeroticism that I was trying to spark in that connection back to the AIDS pandemic, and that back and forth. And it becomes with the bits about making drinks together as well. There was like that social element of party culture and club culture, that again, I was trying to build an atmosphere around the piece as opposed to kind of having these explicit points that I was making.
Yeah, and I think the piece really makes its point through atmosphere and through the sort of brushing of these subjects rather than the kind of spotlight focus on them. I'm going to stop awkwardly complimenting you because, well, why should I stop? I don't know.
No, please, it's really, I'm like, how do I respond to that?
I guess, like, I wanted to ask you as well about, you know, as you've described this process of formulating themes that you were going to write about and address, I suppose the brief for this edition of Going Down Swinging wasn't a thematic one, it was a sort of a formal one. So that kind of prompt of augmented reality and having the chance to collaborate with an AR artist and all of that. How did you, sort of a pretty open question, I guess, how do you feel about an unthemed prompt and invitation, sort of a formal invitation? And how did you sort of go through that process of negotiating possibility?
I love that question. It actually, yeah, makes me think a lot about what I just said, and what you'd kind of confirmed is that the piece carries an atmosphere. And I feel like that the same can be said for this issue of Going Down Swinging, where all the different pieces carry the same atmosphere because they're not talking about the same overt themes. But formally, there is this kind of glitchy, slippery, it's one thing, now it's another thing element to all of them. So I think that's, again, what I really enjoyed about my piece, and what came through in the subject matter itself is this idea of things slipping in and out. So it's like spit, slipping out of the mouth, and drinks pouring out of glasses, and this idea of filling something up and then emptying it out again. And when I look at the different AR graphics for all the different pieces, there is that same energy. I mean, even with yours, for example, it's like the glass that fills up and then turns into the sunset and then it shatters. And it's this slipperiness of reality when there's a digital element there that almost feels dreamlike, you know, and that it's not something that we would be able to look at and visualize in reality. And I just think that there's a cohesion between all of our pieces, even though we're such different writers, because of the fact that there was a formal prompt as opposed to a thematic one.
Yeah. Is that something that you're generally pretty comfortable with as well, sort of starting? Because an open brief is kind of quite hard sometimes, you know, and I guess for anyone who might be watching and curious about how they might approach an open brief as well, you know, would you kind of lift the bonnet on part of your process there?
I mean, I feel like I got quite lucky because the concept had been marinating in my head for quite a bit, in that I knew that I wanted to write about this, but I just didn't know how I wanted it to be done. But yeah, I suppose it's one of those things where I do see life as being made up of metaphor. And so when it came to writing a piece, I was just kind of collating all the metaphors that I'd recently experienced and then adapting them to this form or this atmosphere, which was the kind of augmented reality, slippery, do whatever you want with this tech kind of approach. But yeah, I think I started off with a lot of the kind of free association, like just writing down what came to me and then seeing what it ended up turning into. There wasn't like a structure and a plan. And again, I think that I don't usually write essays like that. I do structure them quite strictly. But that was a response, I think, to the fact that I was trying to mimic that that format, or yeah, that digital format.
Yeah, and did it feel like it sort of defined its own scale or scope once you started writing?
Rereading it today, it was the first time that I'd read it since it came out, really, since that kind of publication period, very early on in the year. And it was a really interesting reminder of how easily the essay flowed into, like, the one paragraph would flow into the next, and they would be talking to two completely different things or two completely different experiences, but the imagery was like so perfectly aligned. And I feel like, yeah, just having it spill out of me in that way was definitely due to the fact that I wasn't going at it in this rigid, okay, I'm going to talk about this and I've got to talk about this and I have to make sure to include this section here. And it kind of felt like having a conversation with myself, which was really fun.
Yeah, which is interesting because it's not nonfiction, right? Like it's an essay, but it feels like some of those structural constraints and some of the sort of kind of topical inclusions that you need to make sure that you account for in a regular kind of structured essay, you're sort of liberated from by virtue of, you know, the poetic form, the cross media even.
Yeah, I remember it was quite late on in the writing process where I had this apprehension where I felt like I hadn't put in enough, like there weren't enough fact-based references. And there was a section where I'd spoken about Mayor Rudy in New York, and I looked back and kind of made a note being like, this needs to be expanded upon, like I have to talk more about policy. And then that comment stayed as like a little amendment to the doc for a couple weeks. And then I'd realized very, very, very close to the deadline that I actually didn't want to do that. And I didn't think that I needed to do that. So I'd left it as this kind of lingering aside that didn't go into more detail than that. And that was really tricky to do. Like, it felt there was something in me, some kind of slippage where I was like, oh, that's not what you would do if you were writing an essay. Like, I have to give it more context, but I didn't. And that was quite liberating, actually.
Yeah, I absolutely relate to that. And this feeling that there's a sort of an obligation to sort of encapsulate not all aspects, but, you know, a multitude of aspects of any subject matter you enter into, even any atmosphere you enter into. It can be quite paralyzing, particularly in nonfiction. So I guess I'm curious about whether that's something you've had to sort of talk yourself out of before. It's something you're really good at doing when you are writing straight nonfiction, or sort of, yeah, a more sort of direct piece.
So yeah, I get quite carried away in world building when I'm writing an essay. And so because of that, I feel like there's this duty on the reader to gauge the context that I've built and then fill in the gaps themselves. So I wrote a piece recently, and it, again, was a bunch of different threads, but I was talking about my interpretation of Muslim spirituality and mortality and the spirit. And the way that I understand the afterlife is very unconventional in a Muslim context. And again, I felt like I needed to contextualize what the conventional belief is before positioning my own. And then had kind of, again, needed to reconcile the fact that, well, no, I'd positioned this essay as like an experimental take on the afterlife. And it's up to the reader to do their homework and understand what the afterlife is in Islam, and then come back into my piece and back into that world that I've built around experimental death is the best way to word it. So yeah, but there is a tension to me that feels like I owe it to the reader to explain things to them, and at times I think that is true, but also the amount of time that would be wasted contextualizing these things would hinder the piece itself. And I also think that when I write about these minoritized identities, it feels like I'm at a disadvantage if I need to contextualize them. So yeah, writing queer narratives and writing Muslim narratives and Palestinian narratives, I don't want to get caught up justifying the kind of origin of the piece before getting into the experimental stuff. I want to bypass all of that. But it does feel risky at times, and I do feel sometimes like I'm going to disengage people by doing that.
Yeah, I was thinking that the whole time when you were sort of talking about this experimental death piece. I was just thinking there's this extra step if you do imagine a white heteronormative you know, bourgeois readership, which I think it is kind of fair to assume in a lot of cases in so-called Australian literature. And is that who you see your audiences? I mean, you know, in spite of yourself, even, is that who you assume might be reading a lot of the time?
I do. And I think, again, there's this tension of me trying to remain palatable to them in a way that's like just palatable enough for them to keep reading, but still kind of experimental enough for them to question, you know, what it is that they're reading about right now. But yeah, I mean, I'd like to hope that the majority of my readership aren't cis and white and straight and upper SES, but I don't know. I think that the literary scene in Australia is very much dominated by readers like that, and that there is a part of me that wants to kind of cater to that and make sure that I'm still infiltrating, I suppose, that demographic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think when you said you felt like there was a potential to be at a disadvantage, I really could, yeah, I
Yeah,
understand.
I think this is a really good turning point for us to start talking about your piece.
Oh wait, but I want to ask you one
Oh,
thing.
okay, sorry. Go for it.
And maybe this is kind of a big question, and feel free to defer it if you'd like to. But something you said before was, I'm going to paraphrase you poorly, but that life operates on metaphors, or that life, you definitely didn't say these words, but that life kind of articulates itself through metaphors. I would love for you to tell me a little bit more about that.
Okay. I have a very good anecdote for this, actually. I was still at uni and I studied creative writing, and I was in a creative nonfiction shoot, and my tutor was like, when you're writing, like, never make up your metaphors. Life does just give them to you. Just make sure you write them down when they happen. And then you'll develop an eye for it, almost like muscle memory. So I started doing that. And it was obviously very early on in my writing practice. So I hadn't developed a voice and I hadn't really figured out what my patterns were to writing. But then the more I did that, the more I realized that the kind of anchors of my piece are centered around these small things that happen, and then I collate them and turn it into this like bigger question or bigger observation about the state of things right now, to put it really broadly. And I kind of, I realized that again, there's a palatability there where it's digestible if you're telling a small story through a metaphor. And then you get to the end of the piece and the reader's like, oh, wait a minute, all of these little things that I understand because they've happened to me are actually about something bigger that has nothing to do with me. And so then it toes the line quite well of relatability and universality, but also it being like my own personal experience. And I guess that also speaks to the way that I talk to this demographic of readers that I don't necessarily relate to in terms of our cultural and social positioning, where if I talk to them through metaphor, there's this universal understanding that they can still relate to a piece regardless of whether or not they can relate to my explicit experience as like a trans person of color living in Australia. Yeah.
Sort of like, to use a metaphor, it's sort of like sometimes you're feeding, no, sorry, this is really bad.
You have to say it. You have to say it.
I'm just thinking of like going to the pond and like forming a kind of interspecies, like a kind of ad hoc interspecies nexus by feeding ducks like bread crusts. And some, like, you don't give them the bread, but you give them the crusts. You form a kind of mutual interest in a situation that disperses, but it's sort of like a ritual of cohabitation or something. I don't know. I'm massively
That's beautiful. It worked. It was a great metaphor. Which actually this is still a very good jumping off point for us to start talking about your piece, if you're happy with that.
Sure.
Maybe if you want to give a bit of context. Actually, you didn't do it for mine. I'm not going to do it for yours. But it's like a near future fiction piece. And the first line is what I wanted, or it's in the first paragraph. And this was the first thing that I wrote down when I'd read the piece and started preparing for the interview. But it was, oh, maybe it's not the first paragraph. But it was the line, sometimes a broken thing in the house is just a broken thing in the house. We're getting too old for metaphors. And that is quite early on in the piece. And I wanted to ask you why you chose to start off this like actually quite poetic piece of fiction with a denouncement of metaphor.
It's funny because, I've been kind of privately, like hyper privately and within my four walls, railing against metaphor for the last few weeks because I'm trying to write another piece, and I am frustrated with the kind of the sort of what I sometimes feel is a sort of florid indulgence of metaphor that I don't so much feel it in reading other people's work. In fact, I'm pretty partial to it. But when I read my own writing, I get really frustrated that I'm circling something without ever approaching it or addressing it directly. And so I've been trying to sort of introduce strictures to avoid that, to figure out what it is I'm actually trying to say or explore or articulate, and to sort of remove the crutch of metaphor. But it's really hard because every time I try to explain why metaphor is either useful or something that I want to sit aside, I use a metaphor to explain why, and it kind of upends the whole project. So with that opening line, I had actually forgotten that I'd written that. And that's quite an interesting thing to think about many months on further into my tirades. But I think it sort of speaks a little bit to a projection of a sort of social aging process as well, where there's something exciting about drawing connections between things in the world, especially as a younger person and a person kind of coming into worlds. And I speculated on that becoming personally tiresome, you know, sometimes, and the sort of the drama, the emotional drama that metaphors can give weight to, the small tragedies that can be amplified through metaphor, was in a way, and yeah, it was something I wanted to sort of disavow for the characters, or at least one of the characters, as they entered the story.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the way that you'd framed metaphor as a way to almost approximate what was trying to be said, but not overtly reference it. And there was almost like and maybe this is me reading into it, but I'd be curious. There was almost a disdain in your voice around subtlety, or you just like want to get straight to the point, with no frills, and really not leave anything to the reader's speculation. And I wanted to understand a bit more about that and where that intention's coming from.
Well, actually, I would say that it's the character's voice and not my voice.
Yeah,
and
sorry.
So it's not even autofiction. But basically, like, I think if I can criticize myself, one thing I'm pretty prone to is having a bit of a black and white thinking, like metaphor is either good or bad. And obviously I use it, and obviously, in spite of saying something, sometimes things just are what they are as that character. The way it plays out is, of course, that figure is, I think, pretty freaking huge metaphor. So
Yeah.
I think what I love about fiction is that it allows you to sort of inhabit and provoke a different voice into life, that that you can place in different degrees of friction with your own automatic feeling and thought process, and that is a nice way to draw out some real world dilemmas.
Yeah, I feel that there's a lot of, I think, tension in the piece. I mean, mainly kind of mimicking where the narrator is coming from in his internal tension, where first we're kind of like learning again about the way that you'd worded it was this social aging process, and how that that creates this diluted view of the world, and you steer away from metaphor. And then further down the piece, there's that beautiful paragraph that's just dream sequence after dream sequence, that ends overtly mentioning glass. My mouth is full of broken glass. and I cannot spit it out fast enough. So there's like a direct, there's a direct contradiction to that kind of anti-metaphor stance that gets posed to the reader in the beginning that mimics exactly, I think, that back and forth that the narrator, I can't remember his name, I think it's only mentioned once in the piece.
I can't remember it either.
I remember trying to dig it back up again, but that, I think that to me was a metaphor about metaphor that speaks directly to that narrator's kind of arguing with himself about whether he's okay with the cryogenic freezing. And I don't know, I would just love to hear more about how you set up this world and this kind of arc that directly responds to his thought process in more of a, again, like a metaphoric, subtle way.
Yeah, my brain is kind of forking in a couple of directions, I guess. In terms of setting up an arc, I'm a pretty stubborn writer, and this is my first piece of fiction pretty much in, I don't know, since I was a teenager, pretty much. I find fiction completely baffling, and I don't understand how people write it, which is what makes it so compelling to me. And so I don't have a process of figuring out what it is or how it is. And I sort of wish I did, but also I'm fine with not. So I sort of write in a linear way. I write forward into it. I didn't have an idea of what the story was about when I began. But I think in a similar way to what you were saying about your piece being a kind of repository of sorts of smaller feelings and meanings kind of built into a larger, more complex cohesion. The thing I like about a contained space for writing is, the thing I like about a story being a contained sort of a bounded space is that you can put all of these different things in, and it can become I don't remember how I kind of came up with the broken statue as an opener. I do know that the dream of a mouthful of broken glass was a dream I had. There were just sort of images and things that I dropped in. And I think what I like about the story as a contained sort of bucket is that it can be a vessel for metabolizing all of these different things and sort of shaking the pan and sort of seeing how different fragments group together. And so it's sort of a way to sort of gather some structured insight into what's going through your head.
Yeah.
It's interesting, and I'm going to just kind of, I have a temptation to not surface things that can make me seem like an even bigger fool than I think I am generally. But the character, I remembered the narrator's name is Lay, and again, this may sort of reek of a kind of muddled intention or execution, but I purposely sought out a gender-neutral name, a gender-neutral East Asian name or Chinese name, because while I do tend to assume that my reader might be white, cis, heteronormative, I wanted for there to be a space for them to not be. And so I know that the character is easy to read as a cis male, and I am fine with that if that's how people want to read it, but I just didn't want it to seem impossible to not read otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's really interesting that you mentioned that. I mean, I've also now just caught myself, like I read it with the interpretation that the narrator was male, but you're right, there is no indication to that throughout the piece at all.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not I'm not a gender diverse person. I am a cis male, and I'm aware of trying not to step into practice that that isn't informed in ways that other people's practice might be. But as a teenager, I read Written on the Body by Jeanette Winterson, and it was, as a 15-year-old, it was like very formative. I just thought about what a fucking incredible feat of evasion and inclusion that it was, and that sort of stuck with me.
Yeah, for sure. I wanted to go back to something, I guess, the first point, because you kind of addressed a splinter of ideas, but when you were talking about kind of sifting through all these different ideas and allowing different nuggets to speak to the world that you'd created, I think that is so perfectly illustrated in the forum asides, but the forum sections that refrain the piece every now and then. And I thought that it was such a clever way to provide this dense image of the world that you'd written. Again, but you were bypassing all these third person descriptions that would have taken a lot of time, and had this been, a novel, that would have been fine. But considering you're working in the form of short fiction, we're not granted that privilege of time and kind of leisurely pace. So I wanted to hear more about that approach. And also, did you know that that's how you wanted to, like, that was the form that you wanted to use in this piece before setting out to write it, or was it something that came later on?
Yeah, I think it came as I was writing it. I don't exactly remember the process, but a word that I've been thinking a little bit about, as other people sort of describe what I do back to me, is polyvocal. I really am interested in lots of voices and perspectives kind of orbiting a situation or an atmosphere even. And I think maybe that comes from my work as a radio producer, but it also comes from, for quite a long time, in a past life, I've been a prolific forum user. I've used Twitter for, more years than I care to remember wasting. I worked as the Wheeler Centre's digital editor, and would often receive, the messages, emails, tweet replies of people expressing different perspectives and trying to sort of direct an argument back to their experience. So that's something that I really miss about being outside. Not that I wrote this while strictly under the thumb of the pandemic, but I think that multiplicity of voices is a way that I guess I get around the loneliness of a narrator and the restlessness of a single perspective, how you can get very tired of one character's voice, and also just introduce some of the chaos that is around us, and that is the friction that maybe we miss a little bit now, in spite of its deeply fucking annoying dimensions sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely felt refreshed coming back to the narrative, to the protagonist, or that first person narration, after there was a particularly long thread of the forum. And then I was back to Lee's narration, and I was like, yes, I just want to hear what they have to say. And it's almost like I was swinging on a pendulum between these two environments, and that kept me going. The pace actually ended up being really fast, even when I was back to Lee's narration, which is quite considered and mellow. Yeah, I was really captivated by it.
I think that the thing as well with the emoji reacts there is like it gives you a chance to sort of um, like it as a writer, it's so nice to be able to just like channel all of your kind of you know your free agent kind of molecules into like these rants that you wouldn't identify with yourself, but that you can see around you, and then to sort of like tally up like the thumbs down responses and the, you know, like it's really fun to kind of inhabit all different sides of a conversation, much like you said you were kind of feeling in conversation with yourself a little bit through writing it.
It was really interesting as well when I think about the fact that obviously, I mean, we're not living in a world where cryogenic freezing is common practice. So I was using those emojis almost as markers of, okay, well, how is it perceived right now? Um, because if there were, you know, 3 thumbs up, then what that commenter is saying is actually quite valid and normal, and there's a consensus around it in this dimension that exists that again contextualizes the those ideologies in such a concise way, in a way that speeds right through and doesn't take its time to kind of explain where that commenter was coming from, and where does his ideology stem from? You know, we just know, okay, well, 4 people agree with it and 2 people disagree. So it was, yeah, I um, sped right through it in a way where, again, there was like a um, immersive kind of obsessiveness to the way that I was reading it, where then I started to feel like I was in Lee's position, you know, where they must have been obsessively reading this forum, being like, well, where do I stand? Um, yeah. I'm going to end with a really basic question just to ground us. But what was you said that the piece is an amalgamation of a bunch of different thoughts that you've been grappling with, or um, yeah, but what was the kind of most poignant one that you felt was the seed that started everything else?
um, that's a lovely question, and I can't remember. But I think thinking back into it, the one that maybe I take away is I guess things like cryogenic freezing are things that they're sort of they're scientific and social issues that, or they're scientific endeavors that address a social compulsion. And while what I wanted to do with the piece was, I guess, as I like to do in the rest of my living, is to try and understand, to think a few steps forward to like, what is the sort of logical conclusion of a position or an interest or a practice. And so while I guess I was interested in exploring the implications of that, taken a few steps further, I guess I also just wanted to sort of draw out the core anxiety or the core emotion of what it is to let go of life and at what point to do that. That's something I've had the privilege of seeing in people around me in my life, and I think beyond all the kind of mechanisms that we construct, including cryogenic freezing, to help us deal with and carry those anxieties and fears and compulsions. I wanted at the center of the story to be a simple and gentle negotiation of that between two people who really care about each other and who also care about themselves.
I mean, that's definitely it, where the premise of cryogenic freezing is not necessarily the anchor of the piece. It's more a vessel used to explore what these two characters are going through and grappling with. And it's such a big topic that you've chosen to take on, and you did it with grace and precision. And I'm very floored by it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's very kind.
I think that's all we have time for. But it's been so good chatting, and I actually wish I could spend a few more minutes learning about the piece, but unfortunately that's all we've got.
Yeah, I have so many more questions for you too, but hopefully we can swap them over a drink sometime.
Yeah. Yeah, hopefully in a couple weeks or a couple months.
Who knows? Maybe when we've been cryogenically unfrozen in the
yeah, perfect.
Thank you so much for that conversation. It was lovely.
Yeah, thanks so much.